Pop psychology ruined one of the most important concepts in neuroscience, and this is about the left and the right hemispheres. It is true that we have two split hemispheres that do two significantly different jobs, but the oversimplification that our left hemisphere is responsible for logic and our right hemisphere is responsible for art led to an awful lot of very smart people to drop this idea, to call it quack, to call it nonsense. But a gentleman called Ian McGilchrist has recently begun to resurrect this way of seeing the brain and brought back this sophisticated understanding of what these two parts of our mind are doing. Now, the first thing you must understand is why your mind is split in half. Your mind is made up of these two computers for a reason. Even your laptop has a dual processor inside of it because it's actually more powerful to have two dedicated forces acting as a team instead of one giant force that's acting as a monolith. You have two hands for a reason instead of one that you throw around and punch. Marriages work on the principle of having two polar opposite genders go together and create a family, create a unit. And this analogy of marriage is very, very good for this because your brain is not one thing. It's not some big blob sitting in your skull. It's two forces, two characters that work together and have problems and fights and challenge each other in order to create this divine tension. Now, take for example language. In order for us to create this amazing phenomenon of communication, we actually split the tasks up into each of the separate brains. Your left hemisphere is almost entirely responsible for categorization and meaning and making sense of things. It's like those CCT cameras you see in China pointed at zebra crossing that are putting these little boxes over all the people and filing everything up and putting everything into its place. Logical processing and speaking itself. You have something called the Broca's area in the front of your brain, and if you get a really bad knock here, you might lose the ability to speak. But if you got the same heavy knock on the other side of your brain, you actually wouldn't lose the ability to speak. But what's interesting is that the other side of your brain is responsible for more of the intangible side of language. For example, the pace and tempo and music of how you speak, the broader context of what you're saying. The right hemisphere is out there looking for the relationships between things, looking for the art, observing an awful lot more. And you start to see this manifest in the fascinating ways these parts of our brain take over certain activities. So accounting itself, categorizing things, organizing these types of flows, linear logical progressions, all of this stuff tends to be loaded on the left hemisphere. But also things like dry explanatory writing, giving definitions, holding definitions inside of your mind. This is all very left-brained stuff, which is not bad, but it can be a little bit sort of shallow. You also see how this stuff loads with political ideology and groupthink. The way a group works is a group needs simplicity. You stand up as the group leader and you want to hand them up simple categories that they can project their emotions upon. And the group wants to be a part of something that doesn't spend its time critically thinking as individuals, but instead can will its instincts towards simple categories. So it's all about simplicity and categories that the left hemisphere would create and being riled up about these categories. Then things that tend to be much more right hemisphere dominated is things like imaginative literature, fiction, poetry. You're seeing language that could turn into this dry explainer style language or accountancy. The earliest forms of language all tended to be about accounting debts and stuff like this. But this imaginative, rich, poetic literature, this is painting pictures inside of your imagination, showing you an image, which is much more what the right hemisphere is trying to do. And of course, we appreciate that more, but it's much, much harder to make. Architecture, these crafting statues, this ability to manipulate space and imagine these big objects that have not existed before and spend the art of putting them together and creating shapes and rotating things inside of your mind. It's all very right hemisphere loaded. On top of this then as well, the act of observing itself, to putting aside the chatter of the mental mind and instead looking at a waterfall or looking at a hill or listening to the birds. This is all your right hemisphere taking over and going into this sort of poetic meditative state. So as you can see, there's a little bit of truth to the pop psychology questions, but it misses out on all the fantastic nuances that actually make up the full picture. Nonetheless, I think this part of neuropsychology is going to rise up again and become a much more prominent idea, and Ian McGilchrist is going to be recognized as a brilliant innovator as the decades roll by.